They said a man's courage is tested on the battlefield, but that's not true. The real test begins after the gunfire stops, when the noise fades, and you find yourself standing in silence on foreign soil, no longer a soldier, no longer free. For the American prisoners of war taken during the great conflict of the 1940s, the fight didn't end when the shooting did. It only changed shape. Their battlefield became a prison camp, their weapons replaced by endurance, faith, and the fragile hope that somehow they would make it home alive. When the war stretched across continents, swallowing cities and lives alike, thousands of young Americans were captured. Some were shot down over Europe, their planes spiraling in flames through cold clouds before crashing into farmland. Others were taken in the Pacific, surrounded by enemies in jungles they had never seen before. In the chaos of surrender, their boots sank into the mud, their rifles were taken, and their names became numbers scratched into records they would never see. For many, the last familiar sound they heard was an American voice calling their name before being pushed into the unknown. In Germany, the camps had fences made of barbed wire that gleamed under frost. Towers stood like silent judges against grey skies. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, unwashed clothes, and the faint bitterness of boiled turnips, the only food some would taste for days. Wooden barracks lined with straw beds housed men who had once flown bombers, driven tanks, or charged across beaches. Now, they fought a different enemy, time. At first, there was disbelief. Many thought captivity would last only a few weeks. They imagined that any day now, their armies would come for them. But days became months, and the horizon never changed. The guards barked in German, dogs patrolled between the fences, and winter arrived without mercy. The cold was not just in the air, it crept into the bones, making every breath a reminder that warmth was something remembered, not felt. Still, life continued in its strange rhythm. Prisoners formed routines because routines kept men sane. Morning roll call, thin soup, work details, and long hours of nothingness. In that emptiness, imagination became their only escape. One man carved tiny playing cards out of scraps of cardboard. Another drew maps of his hometown in the dirt, retracing the streets of Chicago or New York as if walking them might bring him closer to home. They learned quickly that survival depended not just on strength, but on spirit. The men who isolated themselves, who stopped talking, who gave in to despair, those were the ones who faded fastest. But those who held on to friendship, to shared laughter, to something as simple as a whispered story in the dark, found ways to endure. In the absence of freedom, unity became their lifeline. There was a story told later by one of them, an airman named Joseph, captured after his B-24 bomber went down over the Rhineland. He said that every morning before the guards came, one of the older prisoners would stand and whisper a prayer for the group. They weren't all religious, but it didn't matter. The prayer was short, something about holding on one more day. That one more day, Joseph said, saved me more times than food ever did. In the Pacific, things were even harsher. American prisoners captured by the Japanese were marched through jungles so dense the sun disappeared beneath the trees. The humidity clung to their skin like a curse. They carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers, sometimes for miles, because leaving a man behind wasn't something they could do. The guards shouted, hit, and starved them, yet through that cruelty, something remarkable emerged: defiance, quiet, invisible, but unbreakable defiance. One prisoner later recalled how he and others would hum songs softly under their breath, old tunes from home. The guards didn't understand the words, but to the men, it meant everything. It was proof that even if their bodies were imprisoned, their spirits still belonged to another place. Each note was rebellion, each breath was survival. They learned that strength isn't loud, it isn't a clenched fist or a shouted order. Strength is the man who shares his last piece of bread with another. Strength is the man who doesn't give the guard the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Strength is refusing to hate, even when hate would be the easier path. As the months stretched on, they also began to learn about their captors, men who, beneath the uniform, were sometimes just as trapped in the machinery of war. There were guards who smuggled bits of bread, who turned a blind eye to whispered prayers, who looked away when a prisoner stumbled. Those moments, fleeting as they were, reminded the Americans that humanity can survive even inside cruelty. One day, when a group of captured soldiers in Europe managed to build a small radio from stolen wires and scraps of tin, they tuned it to static, listening for anything. And then, like a miracle, they caught a voice, an Allied broadcast from London. The message was faint, almost drowned by the hiss of interference, but it was enough. It told them the world still moved, that their country still fought, that they were not forgotten. The men wept silently. For the first time in months, hope felt real. They learned that hope is not a feeling, it's a choice. You have to decide to believe in it, even when reason tells you not to. Some men did not survive. The hunger was too great, the beatings too brutal. Their bodies failed before their spirits did. For those who lived, every loss carved another mark inside them. But instead of hardening, many found a strange kind of compassion blooming in their hearts. They began to see that suffering binds people together in ways peace never can. When liberation finally came to Europe in the spring of 1945, the soldiers who opened those camp gates were met with silence. The prisoners did not cheer, they simply stared, thin and hollow-eyed, unable to comprehend that the nightmare was over. One officer wrote in his diary, "They looked like ghosts who had forgotten how to be human." But slowly, one by one, the men began to smile. A tear here, a whisper there, we're free. Freedom was no longer a word, it was a feeling, raw and indescribable. Those who survived captivity in the Pacific experienced liberation differently. Many were rescued only after Japan's surrender, when the gates finally opened and the guards vanished. The Americans walked out into the sun, blinking like men reborn. Some fell to their knees, pressing their hands into the dirt just to feel the earth again. They had entered captivity as soldiers. They left it as something more, witnesses to both the worst and best in mankind. When the war ended and the prisoners returned home, they carried invisible scars. Their families expected them to celebrate, to leave the darkness behind, but the truth was more complicated. Nights were hardest. The sound of rain on a tin roof could bring back the memory of falling bombs. The smell of rice could remind them of the camp kitchens. Many spoke little of what they endured, but when they did, it wasn't to tell stories of pain, it was to share what they had learned. They had learned the value of freedom in ways most people never would. They knew that liberty is fragile, that it can vanish overnight, that it's not just a right, but a responsibility. They had learned that kindness can survive even in hell, that laughter can exist beside hunger, and that the human spirit is far more powerful than chains. In one interview years later, a former prisoner said, "They tried to take everything from us, food, dignity, names, but they never took our choice to keep believing. That's what I learned, that belief itself is freedom." These men came home older than their years. Some found peace, others never did. But all of them carried a silent truth that would outlast the war. Captivity had shown them what it truly meant to be human. And so, when they saw flags waving in parades or heard the national anthem echo across stadiums, they didn't see symbols, they saw memories. They saw cold mornings behind wire, faces of friends who never returned, the echo of promises made in the dark. To them, freedom was not something to be celebrated once a year. It was something to be lived with gratitude every single day. They learned that a man's worth is not measured by what he can take, but by what he can endure without losing himself. They learned that courage is not born on the battlefield, but in the silence afterward. And they learned that no matter how cruel the world becomes, hope, compassion, and faith remain the strongest weapons any person can carry. Because in the end, captivity was not the story of what they lost, it was the story of what they found. When the war ended, America erupted in joy. Streets filled with laughter, confetti rained from windows, and bands played songs of victory. Yet for those who returned from captivity, the noise felt distant, almost unreal. They had spent years in silence, years where every day was a battle to stay alive. Freedom had come suddenly, like light flooding into a cave. And while the rest of the world celebrated, these men found themselves standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, trying to remember who they were before the war had taken everything. They had dreamed of coming home, of the smell of coffee in a warm kitchen, the sound of their children's voices, the feel of sunlight on their skin without barbed wire in between. But when they finally stepped through the doors of their old lives, they realized something had changed. They had changed. The world they came back to was bright and peaceful, but inside them lived shadows. A door slamming could sound like gunfire. The smell of damp earth could bring back the camps. Some woke in the night, gasping, certain they were still behind fences. Others could not bear to talk about it at all. They carried the memories quietly, folded deep inside like hidden letters from another lifetime. But despite the pain, there was also gratitude. For every breath, for every sunrise, for food that was warm and beds that were soft, for the laughter of family that reminded them that life could still be beautiful. They had learned to find joy in small things because small things were what had kept them alive. Many began to speak in schools and halls, telling their stories not to boast, but to remind others what freedom cost. They spoke of hunger, fear, and endurance, and how in those years of captivity they had discovered something sacred, the power of compassion even in the darkest places. They told the young that war wasn't about glory, but about survival, about holding on to your humanity when everything around you tried to take it away. One former prisoner named Thomas was invited to speak at a college. He stood before a crowd of students who had never seen war, their faces clean, their eyes full of curiosity. He told them how he had once been beaten for sharing bread with another prisoner. They said it was forbidden, he said quietly, but I gave it anyway, because hunger is temporary, but kindness lasts forever. The hall was silent. When he finished, he didn't ask for applause. He simply said, "Never let hate make your decisions for you." That was the real lesson so many of them brought home. Captivity had shown them the futility of hatred. When you've been stripped to nothing, no uniform, no rank, no pride, you learn that hate only feeds the enemy inside yourself. Some men returned with anger in their hearts, but it burned out quickly, replaced by something far deeper, understanding. They began to see that their captors, too, were victims of something larger, a system that had turned men into instruments of cruelty. In the years that followed, several former POWs even returned to the countries where they had been imprisoned. They walked through the ruins of cities that had once held them captive, met with people who had once been the enemy, and realized that war leaves scars on both sides. One man described it as walking through the ghost of his past. "I expected hatred," he said, "but what I found was sorrow, and sorrow looks the same in every language." For some, captivity had destroyed faith. For others, it had created it. Many said that in the camps, when there was nothing left to believe in, something inside them refused to die. They had prayed when they didn't even know if God was listening, and somehow those prayers had carried them through. When they came home, they lived differently. They didn't waste food, they didn't take comfort for granted, and they cherished time because time, they knew, was life itself. One of the hardest lessons came in the form of silence. Families wanted stories, wanted to know what had happened, but how could they explain it? How could words describe the hunger, the fear, the way a man's voice would fade as he slipped away in the night? Many simply said, "It's over now," and left it at that. But inside, they carried entire worlds of memory. Over the years, their experiences began to weave into the nation's understanding of sacrifice. Books were written, documentaries filmed, museums built. Yet even as history remembered their suffering, few understood the quiet strength it took to live after the camps, to sit at a dinner table and smile, to hold a child's hand and not think of the hands that never made it home. They had learned, above all, resilience, the ability to start again from nothing, to take broken pieces and build something new. That was the greatest victory, one that no war could ever erase. There was a story told of two men, both survivors of the same camp. One became a teacher, the other a farmer. When they met again years later, they talked for hours about everything except the war. Finally, one of them said, "Do you ever think about it?" The other man nodded slowly. "Every day," he said, "but I don't live there anymore." That was the difference captivity had taught them, to remember without being trapped by the memory. And yet the past had a way of whispering back. Sometimes it came through dreams, other times through quiet moments of reflection. One veteran wrote in his journal, "I used to think captivity ended when the gates opened, but it didn't. The real freedom began when I learned to forgive." Forgiveness became a theme among many of them, not because their captors deserved it, but because carrying hatred was another kind of imprisonment. They had spent too many years behind real bars to live the rest of their lives behind invisible ones. In their communities, they became symbols of strength, though few saw the cost of that strength. When neighbors complained about small problems, these men simply smiled. They had seen the worst the world could offer. Little could shake them now. They had learned to measure life not in comfort, but in gratitude. Some helped other veterans who struggled with trauma. They understood the silent battles that continued long after the shooting stopped. They would sit with those men in quiet corners of hospitals, holding hands, saying nothing, because sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The American POWs became teachers of an unspoken philosophy, one built not on victory, but on survival, not on conquest, but on endurance. Their message was simple: freedom means nothing without empathy. Decades later, when the veterans were old, many returned to the places of their imprisonment. The camps were gone, overgrown fields, broken fences, nothing left but ghosts. They stood there in silence, feeling the wind move through the grass. Some bent down and placed their hands on the earth, whispering prayers for the friends who had not survived. Others closed their eyes, hearing once again the distant sound of boots, the clatter of tin cups, the low murmur of men waiting for dawn. But they didn't weep, not anymore. Instead, they smiled softly, as if finally at peace. They had learned to make peace with the past, because the past had already taken enough from them. One said to a reporter who accompanied him, "People think captivity made us victims, but it made us students. We learned what fear does to men, what kindness can undo, and what it truly means to be free. The greatest lesson they brought home was not about war, it was about humanity. They had seen the depths of cruelty, but they had also seen acts of grace in the unlikeliest of places. A guard sneaking extra rice, a fellow prisoner giving away his last ration, a stranger sharing half a cigarette under a moonless sky. Those moments, small and quiet, proved that goodness can survive even in the heart of darkness. In time, the war became history, and the men who once lived it became names in books, faces in faded photographs. But the lessons they carried lived on in the lives they touched, the children they raised, the students they taught, the strangers they inspired. One of them, in his final years, wrote a letter to his grandson. In it, he said, "You will never know what it's like to lose freedom. I hope you never do. But remember this, freedom is not just a flag or a song. It's the ability to choose compassion when cruelty is easier. It's the courage to be kind when the world tells you not to be. That's what captivity taught me. That's what I want you to remember." The grandson kept that letter his entire life. Years later, when he stood at his grandfather's grave, he read the words aloud and realized that the lesson wasn't just about war, it was about life itself. Because every person faces captivity in some form, fear, anger, grief, and the only way out is through forgiveness and love. That was what the American prisoners of war learned, and that is what they left behind, a legacy not of vengeance but of understanding. As the years passed, the men who had endured captivity found themselves living in a world that had changed without them. Cities had been rebuilt, governments had shifted, technology had advanced, and the young faces of a new generation looked at them as relics from a distant past. Yet within each of these veterans, the fire of what they had learned still burned quietly. It was a fire that could not be seen in medals or photographs, but in the way they lived every day, in the choices they made, and in the wisdom they carried. Some returned to the battlefields of life in silence, taking jobs, raising families, and performing ordinary acts that hid extraordinary resilience. Others became storytellers, determined to ensure that the lessons of captivity were not lost to time. They spoke not of revenge, but of endurance, compassion, and the courage to face suffering with dignity. Their experiences were testimonies to the strength of the human spirit, proof that even when a man is stripped of everything, he can still retain his humanity. There were moments of quiet heroism that went unnoticed by the world. One former prisoner, working in a factory in a small Midwestern town, saw a young worker struggling to carry heavy machinery. Without a word, he stepped forward, guiding the boy safely to his task. To an outsider, it was an ordinary act of kindness, but to the man, it was a continuation of a lesson he had learned years before in the shadow of barbed wire. When others are in need, you do not hesitate. Compassion is a choice, and survival is meaningless if it does not extend to others. Many veterans dedicated themselves to educating future generations. Schools, museums, and historical societies became their classrooms. They brought artifacts, photographs, and diaries, scraps of memory that told stories far richer than textbooks ever could. One man showed students a small piece of torn cloth, faded and frayed, that had once been a part of his uniform in captivity. "This," he said, "is not just fabric, it is hope, resilience, and a reminder that freedom is never guaranteed. Protect it, cherish it, and understand what it took to regain it." The students listened in awe, realizing that history was not just a series of events, it was lived experience, painful and profound. Through these stories, the American POWs taught a generation that suffering could forge wisdom, that hardship could create empathy, and that the human heart could endure far more than it ever imagined. They revealed that captivity, though cruel and unjust, offered an unexpected clarity about life, that what is truly valuable is not power, wealth, or even comfort, but connection, integrity, and the strength to remain human in the face of adversity. Some veterans wrestled with memories that refused to fade. They would wake in the dead of night, hearing the echoes of commands, the cries of comrades, or the distant barking of dogs that once patrolled the camp. The world outside had moved on, but inside them, the past remained alive. Yet even in these moments of haunting recollection, they found purpose. They became mentors, volunteers, and advocates, turning trauma into a force for good. They understood that their survival was not just for themselves, it was a responsibility to bear witness, to teach, and to remind the world of what was at stake. One of the most profound lessons they carried home was that freedom is fragile. It is not a guarantee, but a gift. and it must be nurtured every day. Those who had spent years in captivity knew that liberty could vanish overnight, that injustice could appear in quiet ways, and that human rights are always worth defending. They taught their families, communities, and the nation to value what is often taken for granted, the ability to speak, to act, and to live without fear of chains. Despite the passage of time, many of the veterans never stopped reflecting on their captors, the men who had held them, beaten them, and stripped them of their lives. Some felt anger, some resentment, but many came to a profound realization. Hatred is a heavier burden than any prison. To hold on to it is to remain captive long after the gates have opened. Forgiveness, or at least understanding, became a path to liberation, and in this truth they found a new kind of freedom, one that transcended barbed wire and wartime suffering. Across decades, reunions were held. Former prisoners and former captors sometimes met, awkwardly at first, hesitant and unsure. Yet many of these encounters became moments of reconciliation. They shared meals, exchanged stories, and acknowledged a shared humanity that war had tried to obscure. These acts were not about forgetting the past, but about affirming life in the present. They were lessons written in action, that even in the aftermath of cruelty, it is possible to seek understanding, bridge divides, and find peace. The veterans also became historians, not just of events, but of human endurance. They collected letters, journals, and testimonies. They interviewed those who had survived, and they documented the countless ways ordinary men had preserved dignity, courage, and hope against unimaginable odds. Their work ensured that the lessons of captivity would not fade, that future generations could learn from the mistakes and triumphs of the past. In families across the nation, stories were told and retold. Children heard of the marches through jungles, the freezing nights in Europe, the whispered prayers under guard towers. They heard about the bravery of friends who shared the last morsel of bread, the quiet heroism of men who kept morale alive with songs, and the unbroken spirit of those who refused to surrender. These narratives instilled in the young not only a sense of history, but a moral framework, an understanding that resilience, empathy, and courage are choices, not circumstances. Even in old age, many of these men continued to embody the lessons they had learned. They volunteered in hospitals, mentored troubled youth, and worked tirelessly in their communities. Their lives became living reminders that suffering, when met with grace, can create extraordinary strength. They taught that the measure of a person is not how they respond to comfort, but how they endure hardship while retaining compassion. And then there were the letters. Countless letters written to family, friends, and even strangers over the years, recounting experiences in ways both personal and universal. One man wrote to his grandson, "Remember this, life will challenge you, it will test you, it will push you to your limits. But never forget that the human spirit is capable of enduring more than we think. Keep your heart open, be kind, and value freedom above all else." Letters like these became small legacies passed down through generations, whispering truths that could not be taught in schools. The final lesson that resonates above all is one of responsibility. The POWs understood that survival was not enough. They had a duty to bear witness, to remember, to teach, to ensure that the suffering they endured would not be forgotten or repeated. They urged the world to recognize the cost of war, the value of human dignity, and the importance of standing against cruelty in all its forms. And so their stories continue to live, not only in the pages of history books, but in the hearts of those who listen. Every time a young person learns of the sacrifices, the endurance, the quiet acts of courage, a piece of that legacy is carried forward. The lessons of captivity, resilience, empathy, hope, forgiveness remain as vital today as they were decades ago. If there is one thing the American prisoners of war teach us, it is this: freedom is not merely the absence of chains. It is the ability to choose humanity even when the world encourages cruelty. It is the strength to endure suffering without losing yourself. It is the courage to forgive, to rebuild, and to extend the lessons of experience to others. As we reflect on their journeys, we are called not simply to remember history, but to live by it, to honor the sacrifices of those who endured captivity by valuing freedom in our own lives, to choose empathy over anger, action over indifference, and hope over despair. In doing so, we ensure that their lessons do not fade, that their courage does not go unnoticed, and that their legacy continues to inspire generations yet to come. So today, as you listen to these stories, as you imagine the frozen nights, the jungles, the barracks, the whispered songs in the dark, ask yourself, what would you learn if you were taken to the edge of human endurance? And more importantly, what will you do with that knowledge? The American prisoners of war endured the unimaginable and returned to teach us that every act of kindness, every moment of courage, and every choice to forgive is a triumph of the human spirit. Their captivity was long, their suffering profound, but their lessons endure forever, and now it is up to us to carry them forward.